Hi everyone, Jamie Humphries here for Six String Alliance, and welcome to part one of a two-part video taking a look at all four mini-amps. Now I've decided to split this video up into two parts. Part one is going to feature a performance, whilst part two we're going to take a look at the features of each individual amp and do a little bit of knob twiddling and getting some different sounds. Now please stick around after the performance where I'll go into a little bit more detail as to what amps were being used for what parts, how I recorded each part, as well as a little bit of historic background to the track featured in this video. Okay, so hopefully you enjoyed that performance. I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about how I achieved the tones, what was going on. But before we do that, I want to talk a little bit about the song, because this is a little bit of Jamie music history. Now, for those of you that follow me on social media, in particular Facebook, I've been discussing some of my old projects and some of my old music. I don't know whether it's because I'm getting a little bit older, I'm getting a little bit nostalgic. Now, on my last trip to England, I have a big storage container still in England. I live in Sweden, for those of you that don't know, but I have a big storage container in England, which I discovered some other guitars that I had that I'd sort of forgotten about. I've still got some guitars now. I've got loads of amps. As well as my vintage Star Wars collection, but also I found my old 4-track machine, and I found a bag full of cassettes, lots of demos that I recorded on my own, lots of finished instrumental tracks from the sort of mid and early 90s, plus lots of finished demos. Now, I had a band in the 80s that was quite an 80s sounding band, and I keep threatening to kind of clean those recordings up and put them up on, I don't know, a Bandcamp or whatever. I don't really know about that kind of stuff. So at some point I'm going to explore that medium of putting some of these old recordings out. But once that band sort of came to its conclusion in, I think, about 1990, I then really embarked on a guitar journey. I've been playing guitar for a long time, but I met my guitar teacher, Phil Hilborn, who was writing for Guitarist magazine at the time, and helped start Guitar Techniques magazine, which I ultimately ended up writing for and still do to this day. But at that point, I teamed up with some other guys and we formed a 3-piece band. They were from other bands on the scene in the late 80s and the early 90s. And there was one guy in particular who's become like one of my oldest best friends. I've known for sort of more than 30 years now, Jason Campbell, who was kind of my writing partner. We put an album out together in, I think it was about 2007, which was affectionately referred to as Jay, because all my friends call me Jay, and we call him Jay. So we call, actually Phil Hilborn named it Jay. So, and that was a collection of instrumental tracks and some vocal tracks. But back in the 90s, we had this 3-piece band, and we recorded some demos with an original drummer, and then we teamed up with a drummer called Matt Hector, who is, I think currently he is still the drummer with Iggy Pop. And we did a lot of tunes with him as well. And there was going to be an album. And again, the band sort of ended. But those original demos that we did, there were some really good tunes on there. And I've been itching for ages to kind of dig them out and give them a little bit of new life. So I took one of the songs which we wrote called Falling Down. It was originally a vocal track. And I tried to convince Jason to do some vocals, but he's not really in a musical place right now, although I sent him the final master because I programmed the drums, I played the bass and put the track together. And since I sent him the file and went, what do you reckon on that? It's kind of reignited his interest in the old stuff. And he's like, oh, you're going to do any more of them? So I might venture into doing more of these tunes, actually. I'm actually going to re-record Falling Down again. Obviously, I used it as an amp demo, so playing 4 different amplifiers, but I'm going to re-record it again using amps of my choice, the amps that I like to use, and make it into like a finished piece. But I thought it was kind of fun just to put the track together to see how it would come out sort of 30 odd years later, and use it as the kind of template for me to demo these 4 amplifiers. And I was really pleased with the drum programming. I finally got that kind of Doug Pinnick inspired bass tone that I've been searching for. And I was pretty pleased how it came out. It was a lot of nostalgia putting the track together. And obviously when we formed that band, we were really into Pride and Glory. I discovered King's X in 1989 when I was working in a guitar shop, and they had a copy of Gretchen Goes to Nebraska on cassette. And that was it for me. I just followed King's X. The King's X are probably as much of an influence on me as Van Halen. And so when Dogman came out, that really kind of changed a lot for me and Jason in terms of how we wrote. And this was the first track that we wrote sort of after hearing Dogman. Originally, the riff was actually played with a whammy pedal set to a harmony, but I avoided using any other pedals. I just use the amps. I think also on the verse riff, I used the wah wah. It had that kind of Alice in Chains, Rain When I Die sort of vibe to it. Okay, so that's a little bit about the track. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And like I said, maybe I'll get round to actually re-recording the guitars with the amps that I use and start putting some of these tunes up. And maybe I can convince Jason was the bass player and the vocalist. We were a 3-piece band, so maybe I can convince him to recut the vocals at some point. But moving swiftly on, a little bit of track background. The guitar that I used, originally I recorded the track on my old Telecaster. It's a JD Tele from the early 90s. I've used it in a few videos here. It's got a Damasio hot rail in the bridge and a Strat pickup in the neck, and it really was my sound. In fact, I have that black single coil Music Man that I play a lot that has a hot rail in the bridge, which is the same hot rail as I have in that Tele. So that was kind of me getting a Music Man that would be a kind of a not a replica, but a sort of a transition from that original guitar, because I really loved the sound of that guitar, and that was my sound. This guitar was actually a custom built for me in, I think, about 2003, 2004. Again, I kept going on to Music Man, will you build me a guitar that's like that old guitar of mine? And that my arrangement with them at the time was, well, you play these guitars in videos, we'll put anything under the hood, but we want the guitars to look like a standard guitar so people don't become confused, which is fair enough. Obviously, years later, they finally buckled and built me my dream guitar. So this is a Music Man Axis Super Sport. This is a discontinued model, but like I said, it's a little bit different to the soap bar version that they had out. These are MM90s. This is a Music Man soap bar, which has that nice kind of woody single coil tone. That's what I always liked, the kind of crunch of the bridge and the single coil in the neck. But I sort of like the sound of the hot rail as opposed to a full-blown humbucker. But what we've got here is a Damasio DLX Plus, which I put in another older Axis Sport in the bridge, and I like the sound of it. So Music Man fitted this as standard when they built the guitar. And instead of a 3-way switch that you had on the AM90, this has got a 5-way. So it's got a little bit more switching capabilities, and it's got the piezo bridge. And again, it's got the fixed bridge on it, like my Tele, so that the strings are through the body. Now, the reason why I use this guitar, again, I wanted to sort of nod my old Tele. I did consider using it, and I'll probably use it when I re-record this track again with my own amps, not the mini amps. But I wanted to get that sort of crunchy bridge sound, but also that woody neck tone. Now, moving on to the amps, I did try these amplifiers with a 2 Notes Captor X. It did work, but I kind of feel, I don't know whether it's the nature of these amps. They ended up sounding very similar, if I'm honest with you, through that. And I don't know whether it's the way that sort of, I don't know what the power stage is, how they've done it, but obviously it's a transistor amp. I don't know whether the transistor power stage, the way it reacts with the low box, it probably doesn't react. Well, it definitely doesn't react in the same way as a valve amp. So they didn't quite sound how the Mini SLO sounded when I demoed that last year, and I used a Mesa Boogie 2x12 cab, and that had a lot more guts to it, but they all sounded a little bit flat when I used it with the Captor X. That's not to say that it wasn't a good sound and that you couldn't use it in that way. It's just for this demo, I wanted to try and see the tonal differences, and I found that I was able to exaggerate each sound or the characteristics of each amp when I used a speaker cab. So I'm lucky enough to have quite a large studio building that I rent. So 2 rooms away, I've got an amp room. I have a box here built onto the wall where I can feed everything into the control room, and then that feeds into the amp room. So I've got a Mesa 1x12, the little angled 1x12, the rectifier cab. It's a really sturdy little cab, that. And I've got a Lewitt microphone. I can't remember the exact model number. It's a 440 something. I'll put a link in the description anyway. And that's It's a dynamic microphone, but it's kind of an alternative to a 57. And if I'm honest, I tried a 57 and I thought, oh, let's try the Lewitt. And I was like, oh, the Lewitt sounds a lot nicer. It hasn't got so much of a tizzy top end to it, and it's got a little bit more low mid. So it's a little bit of a nicer voiced alternative to a 57. Now, going in, I went straight, the microphone ran into one of my Avalon mic preamps. I was using the mic pre, a little bit of a kind of low cut, just to so it doesn't get too woofy, but there was no EQ whatsoever, and just the compressor just to control the dynamics of the performance. So that's all that went on. So what I did was the main riff was played with the Bogner, the mini Bogner. Obviously, I'm double tracking some of the parts. There's one part in particular which is double tracked that you see me double tracking it, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But the main riff, I double tracked. Once I got the tone, I tracked the main part, and then I filmed myself recording the main part. For the verse, I used the Friedman, and that was the part that you see me kind of two of me. Although it looks like I'm playing exactly the same thing, I am, but I was using different pickup selection. So first of all, I was using the neck soap bar on the Music Man. And then for the second half of the verse, when the dynamic of the drums kicks up a bit, I raised the dynamic of the guitar and I went on to the DLX Plus. So you've got a single coil sound one side, and then you've got the humbucker sound the other side. Onto the chorus, I used the mini Diezel. This was the amp that I wasn't that into at first out of all of them. And it really surprised me. Once I layered that up, again, it was just double tracked. Once I got the tone, I tracked it, and then I recorded the part live in front of the cameras. And that really had a nice sound about it. That was a great sounding lift to the chorus section. For the first two guitar solos, there's a little interim solo and a second solo. Again, the solos, I didn't have much time when it came to this performance, and I wanted to work on new solos. I was a bit rushed, so I wasn't overly happy with the solo performances, and they were kind of based on pretty much what I played on the original. I need to revisit those originals when I record this song again. Yeah, the solos were what they were. They were, I did a couple of takes and was like, okay, I can't spend too much time, procrastinating over this performance. So, I used the SLO for the first two guitar solos. Then, following another verse and another chorus, after the main solo, well, it's two solos, sorry. So you got the first solo, then you got a verse and a chorus. Then we got the little kind of breakdown section. Then we have the main solo. Then there's another chorus. Obviously, I'm still, for the riff under the solo, I'm using the Bogner, and for the choruses, I'm still using the Diezel. Then we have the breakdown section, and I found that the mini Bogner, with the sort of switchable gain, I got a kind of that sort of slightly pushed sound. I really like that on the cleans, especially when I was splitting the coil on this pickup and backing down the volume a bit. I really got those kind of nice tie tabor sort of in between clean and crunch sort of sounds. That worked really nicely. And then that was tracked with a heavier sound using the Soldano. There was an octave melody, which was using the Diezel. And then there was a little outro solo, which again, I was really surprised at the sound that I got. That was with, as the amp is set now, but I put the gain switch sort of in the middle. It wasn't on the highest or the lowest gain, but I didn't have the gain very high. And originally I was just going to play some licks in the drop down section, but I ended up just leaving it to run and just improvise the solo. There's actually a wrong note towards the end. I played a C instead of a C sharp in a little run, but I was like, okay, it is what it is. That sound was really nice. It was a really rich sort of woody sound. So I thought that the performance really sort of showcased the different tones. We got some really kind of tight, ballsy sort of metal sounds with a nice top end. This amp was very kind of woody, and it kind of it captures a little bit of the sort of essence of those sort of hot-rodded British tones that you associate with Friedman. This was very tight, very high gain sounding, and then the Soldano has that characteristic sort of top-end sizzle and lots of gain to it. Now, by no means are these amplifiers going to replace the originals. You know, the idea of these amps is that they're great practice amps, they're great backup amps, they're great fun amps to have in your collection if you're like me. You know, I love having the Soldano sitting there because of my love for Van Halen, and it just looks like a mini kind of 90s Eddie Van Halen rig. Don't think to yourself for any moment that you're going to get the mini BE and it's going to sound exactly like the larger cousin. It's not. But it is a great amp and it has its uses, as do all of these amps. Now, in terms of what's going on with the processing, as I said, when I recorded with absolutely no EQ adjustments, just a little bit of watching the low end coming in, just shelving. I think it was shelving around 60 hertz, something like that, so it didn't become too woofy. The boogie cabs have got quite a lot of low end to them. There was some slight surgical EQ going on once I got into the track, but again, that was just to make the guitar sit. These are quite unusual amps to work with, but with any amplifier, when you mic it up, you're always going to get certain things that you're like, oh, I don't like that frequency or that overtone. So you kind of pull them out, or you sculpt the tone to fit the track. But again, the EQing was pretty minimal. One of my secret weapons that I use a lot on my guitar tracks is the TC Electronic Spatial Expander. I love that, and that was being used on some of the rhythm tracks. It's kind of does some chorusing, or it just does a spatial effect, but I like that kind of mild modulation sound that it adds. Now, for reverb, I tended not to use too big a reverb on the rhythm sounds, more of an environment. So I use the Ocean Way reverb on my UAD just to give it a little bit of a sense of being in a space. But on the clean guitars and the guitar solos, I was using a Lexicon reverb to give it a little bit more space. Again, that's on the UAD. And delay for the solos was courtesy of the TC Electronics 2290 DT. I use all of those TC legacy plugins with the little controllers. They're great, but mainly my sort of workflow includes the 2290 as well as the spatial expander. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit of an idea of the track, what amps were being used for what parts, and how I recorded it. Like I said, there is some production going on. I never lie about that kind of stuff. I don't think it's worth it. Obviously, check out part 2 of this video where when I release it, where you will be able to hear the amps in a natural state. But I tend to like to record an amp or a product or a pedal, whatever I'm demoing, and going, all right, how will this work in my workflow? Will this work for me? Your workflow is going to be totally different for you, but that's my workflow, and I like to see how it would react in the environment that I like to work, and how I like my equipment to sound, or my amps, my pedals to sound. Just one closing thought. There are going to be a certain amount of similarities between the tones because I'm playing it. And no matter what I play through, whether I'm playing through my little Boss headphones, whether I'm playing through a Blackstar practice amp, whether I'm playing through one of these mini amps, or whether I'm playing through my my boogies, it always kind of sounds like me, the way you set the amp up. Also, the other thing to bear in mind, the speaker cab and the microphone and the signal chain. So there are going to be a certain amount of tonal similarities between them. I've tried to highlight the characteristic of each amp, but also in certain situations when the amps were set, a couple of them did sound quite similar. And I don't know whether that's because of the kind of general layout of the amplifier. The amps are obviously the same housing and probably the same power stage, but then each individual amp maker, whether it's Friedman, Bogner, Diezel or Soldano, have voiced their own tone stack as well as their own gain structure. But I think there's going to be a certain point where the amps will sound generally similar. similar, but each amplifier has its own individual set of features. If you exaggerate the characteristics of each amplifier, then each amplifier will sound very different. Okay, so I hope you've enjoyed this video and this little bit of an insight. Look out for part 2 when we do a little bit more of a deep dive into each amp, as well as utilizing the effects loop on each amplifier. That's it for me. If you don't already, please subscribe. I'll see you soon. Bye for now.